There is a moment when an avoidant doesn't leave you. They outgrow the need to return, and when that happens, nothing you say can reach them anymore. This isn't about distance, it isn't about time, and it isn't about another person. It's about the exact second they decide, I no longer need this story to know who I am. Most people think avoidants disappear because they're afraid of intimacy. That's only half the truth. The deeper truth is this: they leave when intimacy threatens the identity they've built to survive. When connection demands a descent into feeling, dependence, vulnerability, they choose exile over transformation. And here's the part no one tells you. They don't walk away emotionally. They reorganize their inner world so you no longer exist at the center of it. Silence with moral justification is not the absence of speech. It is the transformation of withdrawal into virtue. At this stage, the avoidant is no longer overwhelmed or confused. They have translated distance into meaning. The silence is explained internally as maturity, self-respect, healing, or alignment. What once felt like escape is now experienced as wisdom. This is crucial because behavior anchored in morality does not feel negotiable. When silence becomes what's right, returning would feel like a betrayal of the self rather than a reconnection with another. Psychologically, this is the moment the inner conflict resolves. Earlier, the avoidant may have oscillated between longing and fear, closeness and retreat. But moral framing collapses that tension. The nervous system calms not because the wound is healed, but because the psyche has chosen a side. Distance becomes proof of growth. Detachment becomes evidence of strength. The relationship is no longer something unfinished. It is something transcended. This is also where empathy subtly shuts down. Not from cruelty, but from narrative necessity. To maintain the belief that withdrawal is virtuous, the emotional reality of the other person must be reduced. Their pain becomes unfortunate but necessary. Their needs become excessive. Their presence becomes a threat to hard-won clarity. Once this reframing occurs, communication feels dangerous because dialogue risks reopening ambiguity, and ambiguity threatens the new moral order. At this point, reaching out does not feel tempting. It feels regressive. Even longing, if it appears, is quickly reinterpreted as weakness or nostalgia rather than signal. The silence holds because it is no longer empty. It is filled with justification, identity, and a sense of being finally on the right path. Narrative rewriting begins when memory stops being a shared reality and becomes a private construction. The avoidant no longer recalls the relationship as it was lived, but as it must be remembered to protect the self they are becoming. Events are subtly rearranged, emotional tones are edited, and meaning is reassigned. Moments of closeness are reframed as pressure. Attempts at repair become evidence of incompatibility. Love itself is recoded as imbalance. This is not deliberate deception. It is psychological self-preservation through story. What makes this process final is that the rewritten narrative resolves guilt. If the relationship is interpreted as necessary suffering, then leaving becomes an act of wisdom rather than loss. Pain gains purpose. Regret loses oxygen. The mind prefers coherence over accuracy, and once coherence is achieved, there is little incentive to return to the messiness of emotional truth. The story works too well. In this state, the avoidant no longer wonders what could have been done differently. The question itself dissolves. The past becomes instructional rather than emotional, something to learn from instead of something to feel. This shift allows them to carry the relationship without carrying the bond. They can speak of it calmly, even insightfully, while remaining untouched by its original intensity. The danger of narrative rewriting is that it seals the experience into a closed system. New information has nowhere to land. Apologies, changes, or realizations from the other person cannot penetrate because they do not fit the established storyline. To reopen the narrative would require reopening vulnerability, ambiguity, and responsibility, elements the avoidant has already resolved internally. Once a relationship has been rewritten into a lesson instead of a living connection, returning would mean invalidating the story that now supports the self, and people rarely abandon the narratives that allowed them to survive. Loss of projection occurs when the avoidant's imagination withdraws before their body ever does. Earlier in the bond, even in moments of distance, there is still an inner movement toward the other person. Fleeting images of shared futures, hypothetical conversations, imagined reconciliations. These projections are not plans, they are psychological bridges. As long as they exist, the connection remains alive, even if strained. The bond persists because the mind continues to reach forward and include the other in what comes next. When loss of projection sets in, that forward motion stops. The avoidant no longer wonders how the other person might fit into a future version of their life. There is no curiosity about who they will become together, no unconscious rehearsal of reunion, no internal maybe someday. This absence is quiet and often mistaken for peace. In reality, it signals that the psyche has removed the other person from its orientation toward tomorrow. This shift is decisive because projection is how attachment maintains continuity across distance. Desire, hope, and even fear rely on imagined futures to stay active. Without projection, emotion has nowhere to travel. Feelings flatten, not because they were resolved, but because their direction has been severed. The other person becomes anchored in the past rather than anticipated in the future. What makes this particularly final is that it happens internally and invisibly. There is no announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic ending. From the outside, the avoidant may appear calm, functional, even open, but inside, the mental space once reserved for the relationship has been reallocated. Energy that once moved toward us now circulates around me. At this stage, contact feels unnecessary rather than risky. The relationship is no longer something to approach or avoid. It is something already completed in the inner world. And once someone no longer imagines you in their future, there is nothing left for them to return to. Emotional neutralization is not the cooling of feeling, but the removal of charge from experience. Anger, grief, longing, and resentment are all expressions of attachment. They indicate that the nervous system is still oriented toward the other person. When an avoidant reaches neutrality, those signals go quiet. The relationship no longer activates the body. Thoughts of the other person arise without tension in the chest, without contraction in the stomach, without the urge to act or defend. This absence of somatic response is often mistaken for healing, but it is something else entirely. Earlier, emotion was avoided because it threatened overwhelm or dependence. Neutralization happens later, after the psyche has learned how to metabolize the bond without feeling it. The avoidant does not repress the feelings. They dissolve them by withdrawing investment. The relationship becomes informational rather than experiential. Memories can be accessed, discussed, even analyzed, but they no longer carry urgency or pull. This is why neutrality is more final than anger. Anger still seeks resolution. Indifference does not. This state provides relief. Without emotional activation, there is no inner conflict, no push and pull, no oscillation between closeness and distance. The nervous system settles into a steady baseline. From inside, this feels like stability, self-possession, and calm. But it comes at a cost. Neutrality requires the suspension of vulnerability. To maintain it, The avoidant must keep the relational door not just closed, but uninteresting. What makes emotional neutralization decisive is that it eliminates motivation. There is no internal pressure to reconnect, explain, or repair. Even empathy becomes abstract, acknowledged intellectually, but not felt as a call to respond. Re-entry into the relationship would mean reintroducing charge, unpredictability, and sensation, elements the psyche now associates with dysregulation. When someone can think of you without feeling anything in their body, the bond has already completed its psychological cycle. At that point, return is not blocked by fear or pride, but by the simple absence of need. If this resonates, if you felt this shift rather than heard it, pause for a second. Subscribe, because what hurts you isn't their absence. It's the unconscious role you're still playing in a story they've already buried. And we're going to talk about how to step out of that role completely. Shadow consolidation occurs when the avoidant stops trying to resolve the pain of the relationship and instead absorbs it into their sense of self. Earlier, the rupture may have felt like a problem to be solved, a discomfort to escape, or a confusion to manage. In consolidation, the psyche makes a different move. It decides the pain is no longer external. It becomes internal structure. The loss is no longer something that happened. It becomes something that explains who they are. This is a subtle but powerful shift. Rather than processing grief through connection, dialogue, or vulnerability, the avoidant integrates it privately. The wound is folded into identity as strength, independence, or realism. What was once a relational failure is reframed as proof of resilience. This allows them to stop struggling against the pain without ever opening to it. The shadow is not illuminated, it is claimed. Once consolidated, the pain no longer seeks expression. There is no urge to revisit the relationship because doing so would require loosening the identity built around having endured it. The avoidant may even feel a quiet pride in how they survived alone, in how they carried the weight without help. Returning would threaten that internal narrative. It would suggest that the self forged in isolation might not be sufficient or complete. This process also reduces ambivalence. Love and loss no longer compete inside the psyche. The relationship is no longer held as a living tension, but as a resolved internal object. The other person becomes a figure in the personal myth rather than a participant in the present. Emotional energy that once moved outward is now invested in maintaining coherence of self. When pain has been consolidated into identity, letting go of it would feel like losing ground, and people rarely abandon what they believe made them whole. When autonomy becomes sacred, independence is no longer a preference, but a moral absolute. Earlier, distance may have been used to regulate overwhelm or preserve a sense of control. In this stage, autonomy is elevated into a core value that organizes identity. The avoidant does not simply want space, they believe space is necessary for integrity, clarity, and survival. Connection is evaluated not by its emotional depth, but by how little it interferes with self-sovereignty. This sacralization happens after repeated experiences of closeness being associated with loss of self. The psyche draws a firm conclusion: intimacy equals erosion. From that point on, autonomy is protected with the seriousness of something holy. Any relationship that requires negotiation, emotional availability, or compromise is unconsciously categorized as a threat. The avoidant may speak in the language of boundaries and self-respect, but underneath is a rigid structure designed to prevent dependency at all costs. What makes this state decisive is that desire is filtered through ideology. Even when attachment stirs, it is immediately subordinated to the higher value of independence. Longing is dismissed as weakness, need is reframed as danger. The internal system does not debate, it enforces. Autonomy becomes the measure of worth, and anything that risks it is disqualified before it can be felt. This also explains why persuasion fails. Promises of change, reassurance, or emotional safety cannot compete with a belief system. To return would require demoting autonomy from its sacred position and allowing another person to matter in ways that cannot be fully controlled. That feels like heresy against the self they have constructed. Once autonomy functions as an ideology rather than a strategy, the avoidant no longer experiences leaving as loss. It feels like alignment, and people do not return to relationships that violate what they believe is essential to who they are. Memory without charge is what remains when experience has been fully separated from sensation. The avoidant can recall events, conversations, and even moments of intimacy with clarity, yet the body does not respond. There is no tightening, no warmth, no ache. The memory exists as an image or narrative rather than a lived echo. This is not forgetfulness, and it is not repression. It is the result of emotional energy being withdrawn from the past. Earlier, memory functioned as a trigger. A song, a place, or a phrase could activate longing, irritation, or grief. Those reactions signaled that the bond was still active within the nervous system. When charge disappears, those cues lose their power. The past no longer intrudes on the present. The avoidant can think about the relationship the way one thinks about a former job or an old city: significant, formative, but inert. This shift occurs after emotional neutralization and consolidation have done their work. The psyche has decided that the relationship no longer needs to mobilize feeling to protect, resolve, or defend anything. Memory becomes informational, stripped of urgency. Because there is no internal response, there is no impulse to act on the memory, no reaching out, no revisiting, no closure seeking. The past has been archived. What makes memory without charge so final is that reconnection depends on reactivation. Emotion must rise for desire, regret, or hope to move. Without charge, even nostalgia becomes flat. The avoidant may acknowledge that the relationship mattered, even that it was meaningful, while remaining entirely unmoved by its absence. At this stage, attempts to rekindle connection often feel confusing to the other person because there is no visible resistance. There is only calm disengagement, and when memory no longer stirs the body, the bond has already completed its psychological life. The final symbolic act is not a conversation, a message, or a visible decision. It happens internally, without witnesses, often long before the external ending is clear. The avoidant reaches a moment where the relationship is no longer experienced as unfinished. There is no sense of something pending, no internal pressure to resolve, explain, or repair. The psyche closes the loop on its own. This is why it feels sudden to the other person and irreversible afterward. What makes this act symbolic is that it is about meaning, not behavior. The avoidant assigns the relationship a fixed place in their inner world. It becomes a completed symbol that serves a specific psychological function: a lesson learned, a boundary discovered, a chapter that justified becoming who they are now. Once this meaning is set, the relationship no longer evolves internally. Symbols do not change. They represent. This act is rarely dramatic. There is no spike of emotion or clear sense of finality in the moment. Instead, there is a quiet settling. The internal narrative clicks into place. The avoidant stops revisiting alternative outcomes. The relationship no longer appears in moments of vulnerability or reflection. It has been metabolized into identity. From that point on, external contact feels redundant, even intrusive, because the inner conclusion has already been reached. What is most disorienting is that this decision is not communicated. The avoidant may still be polite, reflective, even warm, but the symbolic act has already severed the psychological bond. Words and actions from the other person arrive too late, not because they are wrong, but because they are addressing a relationship that no longer exists internally. Once a bond has been turned into a completed symbol, it cannot be re-entered as a living experience. The psyche treats it as resolved, and resolution removes the conditions necessary for return. When you put all of this together, the truth becomes unsettlingly clear. An avoidant doesn't disappear all at once. They withdraw in layers, each psychological shift removing another thread that once tied them to return. Silence becomes moral, memory becomes neutral, autonomy becomes sacred. The future no longer includes you, not because you failed, but because their inner world reorganized itself around survival rather than connection. By the time these signs are complete, the relationship is no longer something they are avoiding. It is something they have already finished living through on the inside. What remains is not fear, confusion, or unfinished emotion, but coherence. And coherence is what makes return unnecessary. This is why waiting, explaining, proving, or loving harder cannot reverse the outcome. You are not facing resistance, you are facing completion. The bond has been transformed into meaning, and meaning does not ache, chase, or reach back. The hardest part is not accepting that they are gone. It is accepting that nothing was stolen from you in the leaving. What ended was not love alone, but a shared psychological future. And once that future collapses in one person's inner world, no amount of presence can resurrect it. Understanding this is not meant to deepen grief. It is meant to free you from the illusion that closure lives in their hands. When someone is truly never coming back, the work is no longer about them returning. It is about reclaiming the parts of yourself that stayed psychologically attached to someone who had already, quietly, moved on.